when you think about suing your customer and then having to have a business relationship with them for years afterwards, in the commercial context, that's almost unthinkable.
Look, we didn't take that on lightly. That's not your first resort. It's your absolute last resort as a company. You really want to work with your customer to kind of figure this out. And the customer would give us a hard time. What's your business model? To sue your customer?
All players, low down, active, bullseye, 1327. Put tactical. Lights on.
Jake, are you excited today? I'm excited.
I am excited. Today's going to be a good day.
Did you bring your A game today?
Always.
All right, because we have an A-list guest. So without further ado, I would like to actually, you know what, Jake, you introduce him. You guys have a connection. You introduce our guest today.
Well, I feel like I'm getting put on the spot here. Our guest today is the very esteemed Shyam Sankar from Palantir CTO, former COO, which I didn't realize until today, and I think the first ever forward deployed engineer, which is definitely something we should talk about.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk all about it, but welcome, Shyam. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, before we get into Palantir, you have like an incredible, ridiculous journey that hopefully, if it's not out yet, you're writing a book about it because it's going to be crazy. Something about, 10 brothers and sisters, a refugee, your parents had a roller coaster of up and downs professionally. You had some own setbacks. You ended up in the field doing product management, I think, at some point, and then business development. And somehow you are the chief technology officer of a defense tech software company. So we don't have time to go through the whole thing of how that happened, which is why you should write the book and we'll buy it. But you give us a backstory of like, how do you get to sitting where you are today?
Probably the most important part psychographically is, we as a family, we fled violence in Nigeria and settled in Orlando, Florida. So growing up in the shadow of the Space Coast, waking up on weekends to the double sonic booms, filing out into the courtyard to watch the shuttle launch, which you could see. I mean, it was a small dot, but you could see it from even Orlando. And I think my father raised me with a deep understanding of the counterfactual, but for the grace of this country, I'd be dead in a ditch in Lagos. And I think that's really where the journey started in many ways and explains why when I ended up in the Valley, I didn't gravitate towards building Web 2.0 calendars or whatever. But, once I heard about this company with 12 other people who were like, teenagers running around trying to solve problems in national security, I couldn't unsee it. Like nothing else could capture my imagination. And I was going to work on this problem, whether we failed or succeeded or whatever came.
And how old were you at that time when you said, hey, this company in stealth mode, I think at the time, and you were employee number 13, something like that, right?
Yeah, I was 23 years old.
23 years old. Man, I remember what I was doing when I was 23. It wasn't that. It was definitely not that.
How'd you find the crew?
It's hard to remember a world like this, which it wasn't that long ago, but after I graduated from Cornell, my options as a technologist were banking, consulting, or maybe some very large tech companies like Microsoft. And I wanted something else. So I found a way to the Valley. Really, I went to grad school just to get to Silicon Valley. Within a couple of months of being there, I was employee 5 at a money transfer company called Zoom with an X. And I just started working full time. That was seed funded by Peter. And so I got to know the broader PayPal network. And one of my friends was freshman year roommates with Joe Lonsdale. It's like, he's starting this really cool company. This is right up your alley. You got to go talk to him.
You kind of glossed over at grad school, but that's Stanford, right? The Stanford secret is you go there to go jump into a startup.
That is the Stanford secret. That's right.
So Palantir goes back to 2003. You joined somewhere in the early year or two, right? What did you do?
Early 2006.
2006. What'd you do?
Whatever was needed. I wrote the first talent management application so that we manage, this is before you could just buy a simple tool like Lever to manage these things. I built the first demos of the product. I was glorified QA for a long time. We had a lot of bugs for a long time, and I was just bashing on the product. But I got to know it inside and out. And once we started, maybe a year into it, I started living in DC. I would do 3 demos a day, 5 days a week, just trying to find people who could validate the thesis we had around the product, people who'd be willing to use it, people who'd spend some time with it. When we first started, none of us had clearances. So that meant people only would talk to us in baseball analogies. Not that helpful, turns out, actually. So it took a lot to get a lot of momentum and get to the point where we could deploy this product with real users on real data. And then the work actually began.
Yeah, that's a good point. I talked to a lot of people about that are in smaller defense companies, and the asymmetry of information between those who have clearances and access to information and those who don't. It sounds like kind of trivial, but if you really want to solve the right problem, you really have to know what the right problem is. Turns out those aren't publicly advertised for a reason, right? They're very, very sensitive, and there's vulnerabilities that are exploitable. So yeah, getting the security clearance and actually getting inside the room and go, oh, that's the real problem. Okay.
As a kid, did you guys ever play the game Marco Polo in the pool?
Of
Yeah.
course.
Someone says Marco, and yeah. That's what it's like if you don't have a clearance, right? The government says Marco, and you say Polo, and you sort of generally have a sense of the direction they want you to go in, but not really.
I often say that the most valuable thing In-Q-Tel gave us was, well, first of all, a little bit of belief in ourselves. We might be on the right track, but it really wasn't the capital. It was clearances and access to the customers, the credibility to get the customers in the room to actually spend some time with you. And, when we started, I feel like there was no front doors in the Defense Department and exactly one front door in the intelligence community. And that's what's so exciting about the present moment for me is like, okay, there are front doors, there are side doors, there are open windows. Like that part we've solved in mass. Now we have more problems to solve. We go down the chain and we have other issues, but we've made a lot of progress since 2006.
Yeah, plenty of doors into the waiting room.
When Palantir was started in 2003, the thesis was warfare will be transformed by software. That was the investment thesis, right? And then data was the way to do it.
Yeah, very much that the world that we had lived in since the fall of the Soviet Union was not going to be the world that we continued to live in, and that the information dominance was really going to matter. And there was a whole set of skills around the software-defined enterprise that needed to be brought to bear. And that culture uniquely exists in America and not really yet in DC. There's a broader normative view too, which is like in a post 9/11 context, if we can rewind back to that point in time, the discourse was something like, what's more important, privacy or security? To an engineer, that sounds horribly stupid. Of course, they're both important. Why can't we have more of both? Who's working on pushing out the efficient frontier? Why can't we build technologies that deliver both? And so total information awareness is like a world where you think you have security, but you actually have none because it doesn't work, and you gave up all your privacy to have none. So that seemed like the opposite of what we wanted. So, how could we get started on working on delivering more of both?
Yeah. So you've been on a kick over the past probably 6 months, and as a CTO, being one of the, I think, outspoken, not the spokesperson for the company, but pretty outspoken in carrying the torch on software-defined warfare, innovation, modernizing the defense industry, and that's really uncommon for a CTO of a company to kind of take that role on as that torch, carry that torch, if you will. How did you get into that role? Is it something you just enjoy doing, or is it where you said someone gave you the torch and said run and you said okay, or is it just a passion?
Really, it just comes from my heart. Yeah, it's like why I signed up to do this to begin with. I think you could say counterfactually, couldn't you have done this 10 years ago? And I think the honest answer is no, because folks like you all weren't here at mass, at scale. There were very few new entrants trying to break down this door. And the ones that did, SpaceX and Palantir both had to sue the government. It was a very hard journey to get to.
We're going to get to
that.
Don't worry.
That there was a flood of founders, a flood of capital that wants to work in the national interest. So I have a high degree of confidence that, like, as a country, we're in a place to solve these problems. How do we elevate the discourse? Certainly of those of us who have the scars over the last 20 years trying to make that happen, to bring both the technologists and the government closer together to get after it.
Again, going back, because it's the defense industry, creating a sense of urgency is, it's a two-sided sword, right? So you want to create a sense of urgency that we have to do something different, or we're going to keep, getting what we get, keep going, we're going. But you also want to reassure publicly that we're still pretty strong. Don't mess with us, because there is a deterrence aspect of that. And I've always found it fascinating when I worked in the Pentagon and worked on the Hill, of like navigating that narrative is so hard to do, because you end up talking around each other and sometimes canceling out your own narrative if you're not careful.
there's a dialectical component to it, which is like these threats are real. I think certainly in America there's so much alarmism. There's so much like all these things are happening. This is going to end. So then I think people kind of become numb to it. On the other end, it's not like we're starting at square zero as a nation at the brink of the precipice, at the brink of the abyss. We always seem to throw away the rule book and do the right thing and figure it out. And I think we do that best when we're actively talking about it in the lead up to it. And I certainly take I look at the historical analogies of World War II and the interwar era, and industry mobilized first. It is really a whole of society effort in the service of the nation. And we're back at that point where it really requires a whole of society effort. I often talk about how at the dawn of World War II, there was no defense industrial base. We forget this. There was only an American industrial base. And we had those skills in our country. At that point in time, we had just figured out mass production. We were the best at it in the world. We could build the arsenal of democracy by mobilizing the automotive industry, by grabbing Bill Knudsen and rallying around it. Of course, we mobilized Knudsen in 1938, well before Pearl Harbor in 1941, right? So there is a need to make sure we're not asleep at the wheel here. I'd say in the present moment, the reason I've been talking about software-defined warfare so much is we're not the best at mass production anymore. But as a nation, we are the best at software by a yawning margin. So much so we tend to take it for granted how good we are at it. The kind of outside caricature of it is something like, surely this is a culture that we somehow imported from India or Israel or something, but actually we imported it from Iowa. That's what makes Silicon Valley so hard for other countries to replicate. They come, they do the tourist thing, they see Stanford, they think maybe it's a research university, they see the VCs on Sand Hill Road, they think maybe it's the capital. It's something much deeper. It's the culture. It's a Midwestern culture, actually, deeply rooted in a willingness to play positive-sum games, openness in communication, high-trust environment. And it was brought to the Valley by Bob Noyce, the co-inventor of the transistor and the co-founder of Intel. The word open door policy is something he coined. And in many ways, all technology in the U.S., we are children. We're a progeny of a Noycean culture. And it is our great strength that we can use here. Now, I don't want that to sound like somehow hardware doesn't matter. Of course, you have to bend metal. You're not going to be, shooting bits around. But we should be bending the metal with our greatest advantage, which is software.
Well, we're going to talk about bending metal in a minute. Some trauma happened between Palantir and the Army, which goes way back. And I don't even know how far back the story goes. I think 2011 is where I think the roots of the story started with IEDs software in the field. Yada, yada, a lawsuit. So tell us the story of like how Palantir sued the Army and then won.
Yeah, you'd probably back up to like 2009, 2010, when units were deploying. I think they would, privately say that the Army Intel system at the time, D6A, was basically a paperweight. They had these laptops or this infrastructure in theater. It didn't really work for them for whatever reason, and we kind of naively had a software playbook, which is like, look, if our software works, they'll use it. And the further away you went from the Pentagon, the more adoption there was, the closer that people were to being in harm's way, and where, combat is very clarifying in that way. And so there was all of our adoption really came from the field first. And I think there is this sort of institutional, whether it's commercial or government, by the way, to kind of protect the monopoly. So, hey, we have a program of record, which is, I could get into that as a concept. I'm really worried about that as a concept and how it crowds out. It's actually the source of non-competition within government. We have a program of record. It's our duty as uniformed officers to protect the program. Do your best to use the program of record, even if it doesn't work, even if the alternatives, so people would absorb a lot of risk. There were brave leaders who were like, no, it doesn't work. I'm doing this thing. They would get chewed out by their general officers. Why aren't you towing the line? Ultimately, this came to a head because we had so much support. The Army was going about trying to modernize this system. And the way they chose to do this was a cost-plus contract that was going to be developmental, that precluded commercial items from even competing. And that was really the basis of the lawsuit, because there was, in 1996, we had our, $700 toilet seats or whatever it was. And we passed a law that essentially enshrined the commercial item preference, which is this idea, deeply rooted in American capitalism, that the commercial markets are highly competitive. They're going to give you the best price. You're going to amortize your R&D over a broad base. Those companies are going to wake up every day and get punched by their customers and by their competitors, and that's going to drive price performance for the department. And so if a commercial item exists, you must buy it. that meets your requirements. You must buy it. It's that simple. You're not allowed to do developmental. Actually, there's a 3-part test. It's a pretty stringent 3-part test. So if that isn't true, if a commercial item exists, you must see if you can change your requirements to leverage the commercial item. And if that's not true, you must work with the commercial company to see if they can change their product to meet your requirements. Then and only then, if all 3 of those things fail, are you allowed to pursue a developmental. Unfortunately, I think this is probably the most violated law on the books.
Yeah, and you didn't just, so Palantir didn't just sue to win, they sued to open it for competition, and then you, Raytheon at the time, I think was competing against it, and you ultimately ended up winning the contract. It was $800 million or something like that, right?
Yeah, it was, it allowed us to compete, which then took another 2 years, and we ended up winning.
What was it like after you won the lawsuit and then won the contract working with the customer? Right? I think when you think about suing your customer and then having to have a business relationship with them for years afterwards, in the commercial context, that's almost unthinkable.
Look, we didn't take that on lightly. That's not your first resort. It's your absolute last resort. As a company, you really want to work with your customer to kind of figure this out. And the customer would give us a hard time. What's your business model to sue your customer? I once asked a senior member of SpaceX who also sued the government, do you guys still get grief about this? Your lawsuit is every day. And I think to this day, there are people in the Army who will not forgive us for suing the institution, even if the outcome showed that, in fact, this is the better way for the Army to proceed. This is the legal and compliant way that promotes competition and new entrants and delivers lethality to those people who need it most. So I think it was emotionally very hard at the time. We were pariahs as a consequence of doing it while it was being figured out. People didn't really want to meet with us. But on the other side of it, I think ironically, the people who were closest to it were the first to kind of get over it, move past it, and start delivering on the program and like learn something from it. It was the people who are furthest from it, who may not be even in acquisition, who are kind of offended by the insult to the institution, that have taken the longest to kind of get over it.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Is the warfighter, the folks who are actually the end users who wanted to use your platform, were they upset, or were they, quietly, not in front of their commanding officers, congratulating you guys for winning the lawsuit and fielding a product?
Yeah, I think the warfighters all really understood. A lot of them had kind of fought with the product in the mud and understood why this really mattered. One of my favorite stories is actually the prime contractor for D6A, the person on the contractor side. He was a reservist, and when he was called up and had to deploy to Afghanistan, the very first thing he did was fill out an ONS, an urgent operational needs statement, to get Palantir.
That's a conflicted individual right there. And if you're not gonna, I don't even know what to say about that. I have flashbacks of all kinds of situations I've been in where it's like, well, you want the thing that's going to help you get through the day and get home alive, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it. It's like, how do we gear up our system to focus on winning? I wrote an article about this where some people were asking me like, okay, well, how do you run high-performing engineering teams? And, they all want these techniques. But the reality is you focus on winning. It's the primacy of winning, and you kind of work backwards every single day from like, is this the way to run a winning team? As opposed to the aesthetics of how do we want the process to work? And I worry so much about this kind of modern day cargo cult we found ourselves in, this commitment to, whether on the acquisition side, it's something like acquisition reform. On the technology side, it's like, this is how you're supposed to run a team, versus just like the brutal reality of waking up every day and thinking about like, what do I need to break to win? And I look at these figures like Rickover, difficult people with bold visions that had to do really hard things, who had to fight their own institutions to get it done. And I think, or Higgins, to use another example. And a lot of this comes down to leadership who's so hard-headed and so committed that they're going to get it done. And I ascribe a lot of that to a founder personality. Like I'm not a founder of Palantir, but I think about going back to that World War II era period and the immediate Cold War. It was founders. Like we think of it as Northrop Grumman and Martin Marietta, but it was Jack Northrop and Glenn Martin and Howard Hughes and Henry Kaiser and even inside of government, the Kelly Johnsons, the John Boyds. These are uniquely hard-headed, creative, difficult people that are required to win. And I think every startup understands that. That's what a startup looks like. It doesn't look like, milquetoast rule followers who they're always thinking about the primacy of winning.
Henry Kaiser may be the most hard-headed person in the 20th century in America. When you read some of the stuff that happened in World War II that he got involved in, he had no idea how to do it, and then made it happen again and again. He just jumped industries again and again and again. Amazing story.
I think that is the greatest travesty of the Last Supper, because people tend to think about it and they're like, that's when we lost competition in the dib. And that may be true, but I think it's actually probably the most minor consequence of the Last Supper. The real issue is that consolidation breeds conformity. And that is not an environment that founders can succeed in. And it really kicked off the financialization of the defense industrial base, where people cared more about cash flow and buybacks and dividends than they cared about the honest, hard work of engineering innovation. And if you play that out long enough, you get doors flying off planes. It's very hard to sustain innovation with like a fifth generation MBA cadre leading it. These things are hard. They're going to have to be unpopular. Think about how long Wall Street crapped on Jeff Bezos. There's no profits here. And, I don't know about this thing. And it's like, it requires the hard-headedness of a founder to really deliver on these things. And what's exciting to me about the present moment, as I said earlier, is like, wow, I see those people now. They weren't there 20 years ago, but in defense, there's a whole bolus of founder energy to do the hard things where they're not principally motivated by making money. No great company was ever started with the principal motivation of making money. There's always a mission to it. And so, less mercenary, more missionary.
I love it. Now, as a founder, you're going to go where there's an opportunity to actually do something, which was one of the other problems with the Last Supper and the consolidation. Is it wasn't just a consolidation of the industries and the sub industries. It was a consolidation of the opportunities. And that's why the industry had to shrink to right size with the consolidation of opportunities. So the number of missile programs and fighter programs and tanks and on and on and on, they canceled programs that consolidate them. And so you ended up with like the F-35 was a combination of like 4 different programs over time, which became the winner take all one fighter for the next 80 years, which would, in hindsight, it's like, well, that's a terrible idea because your entire industrial base of like fighter production hinges on one supplier. Now, obviously there's things going on now, but man.
I would go potentially even more upstream to that. So I think the root pathology for so many things in defense is the monopsony. The fact that you only have one buyer. I mean, that's really hard. That's like the Soviet system. That's basically saying we believe in central planning and that a single buyer can make this all work. Like, I don't envy anyone who's in that position. On the other end, I kind of believe in free market forces and the innovation of American capitalism. You could ask yourself the question with the F-35, why did we have one joint program office? Like, why didn't each of the services have their own program office? Why couldn't we create more competition amongst the buyers to create innovation and spur progress?
I know why they did it. They did it to save money. That was the promise, right? It was 80% commonality of aircraft and like a $30 million flyaway cost. It was, something like.
Yeah. Every time we try to do these things to save money, we spend more money. Like that,
Right.
It's like, do we believe that competition will drive productivity? I do. And so the consolidation, it was like we lost it then, in a sense.
I mean, how many different jets did we field in like the 50s and 60s? Did we field something like, 15 or 20 different varieties of jet aircraft?
Yeah, we had the Century series and just on and on. Like even like the F-86, even in modern dollars, like the F-86 cost like $6 million. Even when you adjust it for inflation, it's like it was that dirt cheap, and we could churn them out like crazy. Obviously, pretty simple aircraft, but when you talk about joint programs and oversight, when I was in DC, one of the things that shocked me was that at the time, and I think it's changed a little bit now, the joint program, the office, you think of like it's the program office, the office that manages the F-35 has more people in it than the entire Air Force's staff in the Pentagon, which is like insane, the overhead of that many people trying to manage a joint program in the name of efficiency.
So when we were building submarine-launched ballistic missiles, we had 4 competing programs. We had fundamental uncertainty. Should it be solid fuel? Should it be liquid fuel? There's different questions. And the historical analysis says it was actually cheaper to run 4 competing programs to figure it out, not just on a time basis, but on an absolute basis. And so the degree to which, we essentially bestow or revoke monopolies, I think is one of the most important jobs of leadership internally when I'm managing the engineering teams. It's like, who has a monopoly on this component of the product versus actually there's fundamental uncertainty and I want multiple teams. I want ideas to flourish and let's see what works empirically. We are so reactionary to past mistakes. And often the opposite of one mistake is another mistake. So this thing went wrong. Let's introduce process so it never happens. And at the limit, you accrete all this process that it guarantees mediocrity. Like maybe you're not going to have a catastrophic failure, but you're not going to have catastrophic success either. And at the limit, that's going to lead to failure.
Yeah, if you talk to a warfighting commander and you ask them, so, a couple star general, maybe a 4-star general, someone that actually has a warfighting role, not just in the Pentagon, but out and actually a combatant command, and you ask them, like, what is the thing that you want most? And if they thought about it, you could sum it up into one word. It's options. I want options because options give me choices. I have different variables. I have tools for the toolbox, weapons in my arsenal, and I can apply them in a time and a place of my choosing. Having only one tool in the toolbox or one weapon in the arsenal is not really a recipe for success. And I mention that because, and it hasn't been talked about in a long time, but 10 years ago, the third offset strategy was kind of rolled out. And I think it was misunderstood in a lot of ways, but at the end of the day, it was all about creating dilemmas. And a dilemma is a series of options, none of which are supposed to be good, which is why it's a dilemma. And to have a dilemma with all of those bad options, you have to have multiple things that you can bring to create those problems, which means that the one solution to one problem, PBVE process and requirements process just doesn't work. You have to have multiple solutions for problems. And there's not really a good way that the bureaucracy has figured out how to fund and sustain multiple things. And it goes back to, I want either combat capability or I want cost efficiency. And it kind of goes back and forth over the generations of peace and war.
I feel like maybe software-defined warfare is a partial answer to that, right? Limited hardware options, but many capabilities unleashed by differing software packages. What does that mean practically speaking?
If you thought about it a little bit philosophically, like the system we have is ideally suited to solving every problem that can be reasoned through deductively. It requires planning and process, and we're going to get those shape of things correctly. However, anything that's inductive, we're going to suck at because the OODA loop is too bad. It's too slow. It's too latent. The challenge is software is fundamentally inductive. Whereas if you're building hardware, to use a metaphor of building a house, you must build the foundation first, and you build the house on top of it. You actually have to have a pretty good sense of the house you're building ex ante, or you're going to screw it up. With software, you have to build the kitchen first, and you iterate out from there. And that impedance mismatch is so severe that it's been very hard for hardware companies to reinvent themselves as software. You can look at the commercial analogs, like leave the DIB out of it. GE made a huge bet that they were going to, with Predix, reinvent themselves as a software company and almost sank the entire business. And you get this sort of quote, which is like, well, I have more software engineers than Oracle, which to anyone who knows software kind of proves the point that you're really not a software company. And to the hardware folks, they feel like this is the way in which you become a software company. And I think a lot of this comes back to this, like you're going to have to graft the software culture into them. Because I don't think the answer is somehow destroy America's great industrial hardware companies. It's like, so how do we partner with them to transform them? Because it is an American birthright and American strength, the software advantage that we do have. And so that's going to require us to come together and partner more deeply to solve these problems.
This is a good segue into hardware. You recently won. You're the first, let me get this right, the first software primed company to win a hardware program.
That's right. Army Titan.
That's right. Army Titan. Congratulations. That is a monumental step. I mean, that's never been done before. A software company won a hardware program as a prime. So how did you convince all of these hardware companies to be the sub K? That's what I want to know.
I wish there was a simple answer. I wouldn't say it was that hard, really. It was at that point, based on the work we had done on CD1 and then AIDP, there was certainly a lot of understanding and momentum around what the software could do. I think a lot of credit goes to the government and the PM and the PEO, where they understood that, hey, this is fundamentally a software acquisition. Like, yes, it's a truck, but what makes this thing special is not the truck. And I think the market really understood that. So when it came to partnering around this, it allowed everyone to play to their strengths. Like, we're not going to be bending metal, right? Like, that's not what we're great at. And it allowed us to create a coalition of the willing, where we could bring the superpowers of each one of these members into a team to win.
Yeah, and there's like seven or eight companies that are all under your umbrella for priming this. So yeah, well done. It's got Northrop, L3 Harris, Anduril, Sierra Nevada, Pacific Defense, and there's like one or two others I can't remember. Apologies if I forgot them. Shout out to everyone I forgot. You'd sent me a note about something about somewhere in the Cold War letting hardware companies become software companies, which you kind of alluded to. One of the things I thought it was interesting over about the same time is the military got out of the engineering business. So they used to engineer stuff, and now they manage programs. So even though they're engineers, they're actually program managers, or they're technical directors, they're actually program managers. They're not engineering anything. They're overseeing other people do the work. And when that shift happened sometime during the Cold War, that's where I think the government got out of the LSI, MSI business, the lead systems integrator or the mission systems integrator, and they let whoever was the hardware prime, you take care of it and deliver us the product, and we're just going to hold you accountable. And maybe that's where that cultural shift happened.
I think so. I've often framed it as, it's really hard. I don't envy anyone who's in the position of having to develop policy independent of implementing that technology, right? Like, I think Rickover famously had higher than civilian safety standards in the nuclear reactors. You can compare that to the Soviets, who basically irradiated their submariners, and he had to own both sides of that problem of, like, what is my policy around this? And by the way, why will these reactors even work? That's a stable equilibrium can be achieved through that. And I think we did lose a lot by essentially, to the point, the opposite of one mistake is another. I'm not sure the government should build literally everything themselves, but to not have a cadre of people who could makes them less sophisticated is not the right word, but it's more difficult for them to be a buyer and interact with the industry providers who they want to work with.
That's one thing I always enjoyed about DARPA. Obviously not a scalable like production model, but for the S&T, their program managers come as like the lead engineers from that field of science and research. And then that's their, that's the thing that they're interested in. And they learn how to be a program manager, but they're the engineer first with deep expertise in the type of project that they're going to be overseeing. So I always thought that was really fascinating.
That brings up another point that I often think about, which is, like, we really look at the valley of death. We look at the difficulty of transitioning from R&D to production or scaling up innovations, and we think, what process, or how could we solve this, or what could we do? And I think actually, unfortunately, that's just a 0 to 1 problem. Like, I've probably had to do that 6 or 7 times in my career. Every single time I've gone from an R&D thing to scaling it, making it real, it is chewing glass. It is hard. It is a function of the quality of the leaders. And that's really the lesson I take away from it. Like, the way you bridge that is with humans. There is no process to get through that. Why I focus so much on the Rickovers and the Boyds and the Kelly Johnsons is, like, we need to get back to lionizing those unique individuals who could chew the glass to bridge that valley of death and take things from R&D to production. And that's what it's going to continue to look like. That's just reality.
The defense ecosystem is also, I don't want to say it's unique, but maybe it's unique in that there isn't a systems integrator in the ecosystem who is not also a competitor with the folks they might want to subcontract with. There is no TSMC in defense who says, you design the capability and you bring it to me and I'll just crank it out, right? So there could theoretically be someone in the ecosystem whose role it was to help people move from R&D to production at scale.
Hey, don't be giving away my startup ideas.
Oh, Mike, this is my favorite one.
I definitely see this. I mean, I'd say it rhymes with one of the concepts I'm really working on, which is, like, how do we, there's a role for a software integrator. Like, if we think about what we expect of our lead systems integrator. Somehow you're supposed to create the infrastructure for a multi-vendor big tent ecosystem and do the product management. But really, you want someone whose job it is to, have the PM come to them and say, look, I just went to this really interesting place in the US. I met 3 companies. You have 48 hours to onboard them to an accredited stack with production data and production users. Like, how do we close those kill chains and shrink that some more? And I think there's a huge role. Like, I see by just pure, our pathing as a company, people tend to think about the software we've built, Gotham Foundry, but we've been less public historically about the software infrastructure we had to build to enable modern American software to be delivered to the department. Because my lived reality is not that I have one product to deliver. It's that I have 150 dev teams building 5,000 microservices, deploying some collection of those to 1,000 production environments. And, they don't want to talk to each other. They don't work. How do I build a governed ecosystem where I own the interfaces, where things are interoperable, and ultimately to the end user, it feels like one cohesive thing? I get to focus on the product management. That is exactly what I think every program tells me they want. Hey, I want a multi-vendor Big Ten ecosystem. I want to be able to bring in competition. I want to be able to swap in the latest innovation. And the answer is you deserve all of that. And the only way you're going to do that, it's not with butts and seats, labor, managing with process. You're going to need the software infrastructure that does that. And then as a consequence, you become the allies to these new entrants. I'm going to get you to the starting line. I'm not going to get you to the finish line. You got to compete and do that. But let's get rid of all of that brain damage that happens between someone saying, I'm interested in your tech, and getting you into production to compete and win.
It's almost like your founder's toolkit.
I think so. And I think the number of companies and the interest in doing this is very high. So yeah, it's an exciting time to execute that.
I think there's a business strategy where you have a consortium that's government funded for, 100 licenses a year or something to start with. And then you'd bring in small companies with promising tech in the consortium. And that way they don't even have to pay for the access to the tooling. It's through the consortium from the government.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm even going a step further saying, well, I've already got this software infrastructure everywhere I've deployed my software. Why can't we just flip a switch and say it, instead of saying this software infrastructure is running Palantir, it can run any third-party software. You want to get Rebellion Defense deployed, Slingshot Aerospace, Anduril, whoever you want, you, the government, you have the opinion. I'm not going to stand between you and your relationship with those companies, but I'm going to help you close that chain so they can be deployed to production on top of this data in a way that's accredited, that respects the access control, and gets them a running head start.
So about 50% of Palantir's revenue is from the private sector. Is that where some of this is coming from? You see the speed of business?
The brutality of the commercial markets. Like, I enjoy waking up every day and getting punched in the face. Like, that space moves so fast. There's so many, the number of new entrants there, it is where so much innovation comes from. Like, we built the supply chain infrastructure for Operation Warp Speed with General Perna in roughly 5 weeks. But I could only do it in 5 weeks because 2 years prior, I had built the underlying technologies to optimize hydrocarbon production. So the diversified R&D base I have against the world's largest companies, against their hardest problems, ends up being massively valuable to the department. Whereas in the 60s and 70s, it really went the other way. The unique things you were doing in government would slowly leak out to the commercial world. My experience is, and I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but the vast majority of innovation we're able to bring to bear in government is because we've had to pressure test that and develop it at scale in the commercial world.
Yeah, it's like 80-20, right? For R&D spending at least in the US right now, 80% commercial, 20% defense. And then 50 years ago, it was 20-80. So it's completely flipped.
And I think there's even a quality difference there, not to like double down too hard on that, but you think about how much of the defense spending on R&D is effectively cost reimbursement for the contractors. Like, you're not really putting your own balance sheet at risk here. The amount of conviction you need, the sorts of people you put in charge, the expectations for return, you don't get punched in the face quite the same way when it doesn't work out. When Apple puts $10 billion to work on a self-driving car, that's very different. They're not passing you a surcharge on your next iPhone for that.
Maybe even worse, the service labs, not to beat them up too much, but there's just no incentive to ever transition the technology they work on, right? Like, who knows what's sitting on the shelf somewhere at ARL or AFRL? Almost impossible to get that technology put into anything.
And in many ways, they compete with industry. defense, national security is an enterprise that is about American prosperity. And, we shouldn't lose the plot on that. These things are related. When Bob Noyce was selling 96% of his chips, he was selling to the Defense Department in the 60s. He always had in mind a much bigger commercial market that created massive American prosperity for all of us. And I think about the counterfact. You could look at DJI and General Atomics. If we had a different sort of regime where we had constraints with the FAA, we had a way in which the U.S. government looked at ITAR regulations around the drone, but General Atomics developed the Predator on their own dime. It was not cost reimbursed. It was a product they built. DJI should not exist. General Atomics should have spun off a division or become the commercial drone provider to the world. And that would have had massive impacts on American prosperity and quite meaningful implications in the present moment with regard to Ukraine.
Let's segue into what you talked about with the primes. You had a recent article about making the primes more valuable. And I think that's what you're kind of alluding to, which is put your own money up, build a product with higher margin. Even though you have less revenue, you have higher margin, and then you'll be valued more like most commercial companies are. And I don't think most people understand the nuance in the markets. Like a defense company is valued completely differently than a normal company, right? Because of the way that the cost plus contracts kind of manifest over time.
Yeah. Again, I blame the monopsony. I don't blame the primes. They're responding to their incentives. But when the FAR caps your profit at 10% or 15%, depending on the contract type, you start getting into, what is your optimization? It's really around cash flow. It's the sort of investors you accrete over time are interested in predictable returns. It becomes very hard to be innovative here. And it becomes, I think, even more hard when you think, okay, 86% roughly of tech market cap is American. That's where our greatest minds are going these days. That's where the return is for them as individuals. That's where things are moving fast. So if we want to have a broader industrial base, we're going to have to figure out how to make these companies valuable. If you want a top AI engineer, a top one, it's like $10 million a year. You're not going to fit that person into a cost reimbursed contract. And I'm not saying everything is about money, because it's really not. There are plenty of hardworking people who are brilliant at these primes. And I've often wondered, okay, if you have a competition, why do you care what the costs are? Select the best price, select the best value. It really shouldn't matter what that.
It's cost per capability. Right? Margins shouldn't matter at all.
Yeah.
I think that the knock-on effect too, that's so
Call it value.
Value. The value matters.
Yeah. Like when you go, and I deal with this in my day job, like how much does it cost? Like, well, what does it cost you? Like, what's the value? Like how do you quantify value is a very subjective thing. And so how to do that in a way that is objective and not subjective. You use this is going to replace that and it's going to do it X amount better at this much cheaper. And so the value is efficiency and resiliency. And so trying to put a price on some of those things gets really, really hard. And maybe, the cost plus is your whoopee blanket, right? Like, hey, I know what I'm going to get. It's simple. It's the safe thing to do. There's a lot of uncertainty with this other stuff. And maybe that's, culturally, I would think from what I see, how much does the thing cost? Like, well, what do you want to pay for it? It's a really interesting discussion in software. And Shyam, you probably lived this many, many times of how do you determine how much your software costs? Well, it's based on, value to the customer. How much, what is the thing that's going to help you do? And then how do I quantify that in a way that makes sense? Like you don't go into Verizon and see an iPhone and go, well, let me see the bill of goods. Let me see how much it costs to put this thing together. And then you go, oh, man, it's about this. Yeah, that makes sense. I know what I'm getting from a smartphone. I want to buy it.
I think it's a crucial point because you can only value software based on value. People look and they see, okay, well, your software has zero marginal costs for an incremental deployment. You're just copying and pasting and fleecing us, but you're not accounting for the $5 billion of capital and the $500 million of ongoing R&D each year it took to make this zero marginal cost product. And then the risk is on the company that they can produce enough value that the market will meet and the customers will pay for it. And so I think it is probably the single biggest thing that handicaps the wielding of America's software advantage is this fixation on the cost plus paradigm. I can do this developmentally. There's also a lack of intellectual humility, which I think is endemic amongst all engineers, including my own, where they see a piece of software and they're like, I could do that. How hard could that be? And it turns out it's hard actually. And
hardware engineers too. It's always the answer.
Yeah.
I can do that. Give me $1 million in 2 months and I can build that.
You've been at the top, Palantir, been doing a thing for a while. You're the chief technology officer, which part of that is, besides chewing glass and getting punched in the face every day, those are your words, not mine, you got to be thinking about the future. So never stop building. Don't get comfortable or you're going to get disrupted. What do you think the next thing in the next few years that you're kind of keeping an eye on? Where do you think that future is?
The two things I'm really passionate about is helping this new cadre of companies and the primes kind of helping the primes reinvent themselves as software companies, helping the new cadre of companies really succeed, like fulfilling this vision around big tent, multi-vendor ecosystem. But the other part, which spans not just the defense industrial base, but more broadly the West, is software-driven reindustrialization. To your point, 50% of the business is commercial. Well, that's helping Airbus build A350s. It's helping BMW and Chrysler build cars. It's helping aerospace manufacturers and wind turbine manufacturers. And increasingly today, software is defining production. And a lot of the value comes from, in government, on the mission side, we talk about it as a kill chain from sensor to shooter. Well, in the commercial world, you call it a value chain. From the hand of your supplier to the hand of your customer. It's actually the same problem. You're making a series of integrated decisions. Every decision you make constrains the decisions that can be made subsequent to that. And you're trying to get into and improve your OODA loop on how do you make better and better decisions to win. And this is a huge source of value loss in production, where how procurement is run, visibility into your supply chain, what you're cleared to build, how you schedule these things, how you schedule your workforce, how you manage the integration of that with S&OP, sales and operations planning. And then what do you do once these assets are in service? I'm constantly shocked to see the amount of sensors that we have in our cars that are real time telling the OEMs which parts are failing, what are the error codes. Even before you know there's a problem with your car, they're using that to manage their cost of quality, their cost of warranty, the allocation of repair parts with the dealers. We don't put those sensors in our tanks. We don't put those sensors in our assets because of how we've thought about and contracted this. This is where if we bring this together and really make it, we put the pebble in the shoe of the folks who are producing this to capture more margin by delivering a superior, more valuable product, we increase our lethality immensely. So the broad theme of how is the West going to compete on reindustrializing is something I'm spending a huge amount of time on. And I think I have the inklings of how to do that, how to be partners to these companies and redefining their production through software.
I always thought it was crazy when you look at like hardware, tanks, aircraft. Traditionally in the military, upwards of 70% of a weapon system's cost is in the sustainment. So operations is the sustainment. And so much little thought is put into like, how do I reduce that cost? Because that's like the biggest chunk of the pie of the cost, whether it's like predictive maintenance or putting in the sensors like you talked about.
And of course, with cost plus, why would you want to shrink the cost? You're going to shrink the plus. Yeah, I think it's a great point because in automotive, if your cost per unit is not decreasing for the same model by between 4 and 7% every year, you're getting fired. That's the expectation of price performance there. In defense, it basically grows by 7% every year. So somehow the incentives are not quite right.
I won't say we shouldn't put sensors in all of our platforms because we probably should. But I will say that does increase the attack surface. And so the cyber security part has to come hand in hand.
It does. It does.
I've often thought about how could you attack the sustainment or O&M tail here and creating some sort of mechanism. I've called it sunset pricing. Like something costs $100. Well, if I could show up and do that same thing for $50, how can I earn that contract? Like, how do we create more incentives for people to enter this process where they're yielding cost savings to the government? I'm all for doing acquisition reform. I think the big end of the problem is really leadership and ensuring that we protect the hard-headed people in government who are willing to do the difficult, unpopular things, which is often what it comes down to. But I think creating more mechanisms where something like that's possible would enable new entrants, because we do not have a problem with capital formation in this country. Our capital markets are the richest, deepest, most innovative. And if you could create ways in which people can go raise capital against these ideas, you'll have the private sector putting its balance sheet to work to deliver innovation for the industrial base, for the Defense Department, that cannot be done in a typical cost plus sort of manner. So how do we unleash American creativity on this?
Strong thoughts.
I want to go back real quick, real quick to something that we talked about early in the conversation, because I think we were like on the cusp of a spicy take.
Uh-oh. We haven't had one of those in a while.
We haven't. We were talking about the original sin, which is that the DoD is a monopsony. And so how do you fix the original sin? Well, you can nibble around the edges, or you can make multiple buyers. So how do you make multiple buyers in this market? Well, I guess you could have a large PMC or two. I don't think we're going to do that in the short term, although it is an interesting thought experiment. But what about multiple program offices competing for the same capability gap, or trying to solve the same capability gap? Is that something that is viable? It seems kind of crazy to say.
I think it's very viable. I think it would be probably the single biggest technical reform we could do, because the reality is it's very hard to wake up every morning with the urgency of fighting China and being prepared. It's kind of too abstract. But what we are good at as a nation, as hyper-competitive Americans, is waking up knowing that there's another American PM 2 doors down from you who's trying to beat you at this program. Even if we take our experience with Titan, we had one PM overseeing Raytheon and Palantir competing against each other. I would have much rather had 2 PMs, one for Palantir, one for Raytheon. We are essentially co-conspirators in delivering the very best product with the most lethality to our soldiers. And then as a consequence, creating more room for the PM to have opinions on like which requirements really matter. Let's think hard about how we're going to show up and win this competition at this next soldier touch point. Let's think hard about what Charlie Flynn really needs in the Pacific. What is he telling us? You have now incentives to incorporate warfighter feedback. And we often talk about how requirements are broken. Well, I don't think we're going to like magically get away with them. This gives us the discretion. It introduces surface area for discretion on how do I weight all these requirements? Because at the end of the day, someone is going to cut this steak and that steak, and they're going to taste it, and they're going to see which one works best, to the point of it being inductive fundamentally. The pushback is often something like, well, that sounds like it's going to be more expensive. But I think, honestly, you want to see price performance improve. You want to see unit costs drop. You want to see like capital deployed to make production faster. This is how you get it. This is fundamentally leveraging competition.
I love the idea of 2 colonels showing up at the Pentagon, the E-ring, every day, going into their separate offices. One of them's going to retire a colonel. One of them's going to get a star, all for running like the competing IVAS program office. Like we should run this experiment, right? And just see what happens.
Yeah, it's got to be something different. We can't keep doing what we're doing. And to your point, Shyam, like that's what you've been saying, is like we have to do something different. Turns out the biggest risk is actually inaction. That is the biggest risk now, which is probably the one takeaway of this whole conversation. The sense of urgency to do something different.
Amen.
Well, I want to leave you with the last words.
Well, I think it is a unique moment. I think we are essentially in an undeclared state of emergency, and that we have these unique strengths as a nation to wield. That defense of the nation has always been a whole of society effort. I'm excited to see that the capital class has shown up in force. The founders have shown up in force. The department has created new doors. Like, we are making collectively a huge amount of progress here. And I think by coming together and focusing on it, we are going to win.
I love it. Last question I have for you. Save the Shire. What is that about?
Well, the Palantir name is a reference to Lord of the Rings here. And, and the hobbits were reluctant, quite comfortable creatures living in their idyllic Shire. And they set out to Mordor and beyond in an effort to save the Shire. It reminds us of what we're trying to do.
I got about half of that reference. I'm not a Lord of the Rings fan, which I know is like sacrilege.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. In the early days after meetings, there'd always be like a colonel or a major who would kind of reluctantly come up and kind of acknowledge, I know what Palantir means. They kind of acknowledge, like, just like you, I too did not have a social life in high school. A little solidarity.
Is the first breakfast, I mean, it's obviously a reference to the Last Supper, but is it also nod to the fact that hobbits eat a second breakfast?
That is a delightful coincidence, which I have made a lot of fun of in a good way inside of the company. Yes, I think it's poetic in how it works out.
Now you guys are just nerding out. I don't even know what you're talking about anymore. All right. Well, with that, I really appreciate your time, Shyam, and I'm looking forward to catching up next time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys.